Well, good morning and welcome to the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's good to see people here in a live audience. This is, I think, the second live audience we have had during COVID tide. Of course, there will be more. Now that the election's out of the way, you know, there's no longer a pandemic. Yes, we might be a little feisty this morning, but we are in great spirits because we woke up this morning in the United States of America, even better in Texas. And even though the capital city has seen better times politically and in terms of policy, it's still the greatest capital city and the greatest state and the greatest country in the history of the world. To my friends, Chuck DeVore and Josh Trevino, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
I think I know everyone in the audience, but we have a lot of people tuning in online. And if we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts, the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And it is a real pleasure to have you join us for this post-election analysis. Of course, Chuck and Josh, this is going to be a little more present tense, because let me start by saying this election is not over. We're still counting votes. Of course, this foundation believes in the integrity of every election for the sake of every single vote. Every legitimate, valid vote must be counted, and every illegitimate, invalid vote must not be counted, period. So let us start there. And what we're going to do is analyze not only the problems surrounding election integrity, which are going on right now in this election, but also we really want to emphasize on some opportunities that we see, regardless who is going to be giving the inaugural address on January 20th, 2021. And let us be clear, the three of us believe that over the next few days, perhaps even the next few weeks, that the outcome of the presidential election is going to be unclear. And let us also be clear that when we have counted every valid vote and when we have dismissed every invalid vote, that whatever the outcome of that election is, even if it's the guy you didn't vote for, it's time for us as Americans to unite and honor the outcome of that election. That's what it means to be an American. And certainly this foundation will do so. But we're not there yet. And so what we're going to do today is walk through an analysis of the election. We're also going to look at the opportunities ahead, especially for the conservative movement. But of course, because we're all conservatives, we think those are opportunities for Texas and for America. And so let me introduce my friends and colleagues here. Chuck DeVore is our Vice President for National Initiatives. You also know him as the unofficial, official Fox News contributor. So Chuck, thanks for making time for me today.
All right.
And Josh Trevino, our Chief Innovation Officer, which means that he's a really smart guy, handsome and dashing and charming, all of those things that will be on display today. So Chuck, let's cut straight to the chase. We're going to get to audience questions, both questions from our friends here in person and also questions from the audience online. But before we do that, I just want to give you, or have you give us, a state of the race right now as it stands. High noon, Texas time, day after the election.
Well, it certainly is very unsettled, Kevin, and it's unsettled because of a combination of things. You had some very close races, and because of the viral pandemic and this rush to use mail-in ballots, many times in states that frankly weren't equipped for it. They didn't have a tradition of a large number of mail-in ballots. So in the case of Pennsylvania, which is kind of ground zero right now, 4 years ago, they had about 300,000 mail-in ballots that were requested. Today, we're looking at some 3 million that were requested and maybe 2.5 million that were actually returned, or certainly returned by election day. And as a result, the system in Pennsylvania wasn't particularly robust enough to count a tenfold increase in mail-in ballots. And so you saw competing lawsuits, you saw really legal decisions that really made one puzzle. For example, the mail-in ballots are now, they don't require a signature to be verified. They can be accepted until Friday, as long as they were postmarked by Tuesday. There'll probably be a lawsuit about whether postmarks are even necessary, and that'll be adjudicated. And so if you look at President Trump's margin in Pennsylvania right now, it's a little less than 500,000 votes as of a few minutes ago. And there's some, I don't know, probably 1.3 million or so outstanding mail-in ballots, and most people think that that'll break very heavily to Vice President Biden. And at the end of the day, maybe he'll be up, maybe not, right? I mean, but we won't know that for several days. You have similar situations in Georgia, which is too close to call. The president's ahead in Georgia. It's looking like North Carolina will go for the president. So if you just look at those 3 states, and then potentially the one congressional district in Maine, what you end up with if you give Vice President Biden the Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona, which is still in play, and Nevada, which is still in play. Only 8,000 votes separate them in Nevada. If you just give the latter 2 and the upper Midwest to Biden, then he only has 270 electoral college votes, exactly what you need. And so I'll just leave this tantalizing thing for everyone in the audience. If all 538 electors are impaneled, then you need 270 to win. But 4 years ago, we had 7 faithless electors. 5 defected from Hillary Clinton, 2 defected from Trump. If Biden just has 1 faithless elector that votes for, let's say, Bernie Sanders, the election is then pushed into the House of Representatives. And you thought 2020 was over.
Chuck. The purpose of this panel is to bring people solace that
Sorry,
things will get better.
No.
Not yet.
I'm the guy that in California, since I'm the
Are you from
buzzkill.
California?
I'm the buzzkill.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Josh Trevino, you're in a really tough spot, and that's to be more optimistic than Chuck DeVore.
I think I can do it. But what I can't be optimistic about is the state of this particular race, and it's not because I'm pessimistic. It's because I just don't know for all the reasons that Chuck set forth. There is such a variety of cross currents and possibilities inherent in the states that we're looking at right now that anybody who tells you that they know what's going to happen is lying, or they're deluded, which may mean they're a pollster. So you should avoid that. What I can be optimistic about, though, is the state of the conservative coalition. What's really, really interesting about last night is I think we are seeing the emergence of a realignment that has been coming for some time. And we're seeing the contours of a conservative coalition that is multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, and working class that is probably going to define American life and politics for the next decade. And I'm very, very excited about it. You know, you think back to 2016 and kind of what the media left narrative was about the ascent of President Trump and the conservative coalition at that time. And it roughly followed this contour with some variations, that the president became president specifically because aging white people, guilty on this part, but aging white people decided to grasp for control of the country before fading into nothingness. And it was the last gasp of an essentially racist white supremacist structure that was seeking to stop change in America for whatever reason. It depends on which issue of the Atlantic you read, which variation of the thesis you get. But that was basically it. And so Donald Trump is literally Hitler. But what we found yesterday is that he's the worst literally Hitler ever. Because what he did yesterday and what the conservative coalition did yesterday in the elections, whatever the outcome, is they actually lost white support and they gained support in every other demographic out there. So increased support for the president among African-American men, among African-American women, among Hispanics, Mexican-Americans in particular. Those of you who know South Texas know that Zapata and Starr County went for the president yesterday, which is completely insane. Even in places like Cameron, which ended up going for Biden, the improvement in performance was on the level of 20 to 30 points. Absolutely, absolutely incredible to see the Rio Grande Valley and the Texas-Mexico border start to go red, really for the first time in modern history. Look at the state of Florida. The state of Florida, of course, was regarded as a battleground in the polling aggregates, which I actually tracked, along with Chuck prior to the election. Florida looked like it was going to go blue. But who sent Florida red yesterday? Puerto Ricans and Cubans. Puerto Ricans and Cubans. And now keep in mind, the irony of this is that one of the threats the left was deploying were when we get power, we're gonna pack the courts and we're gonna implement 9 extra genders and we're gonna make Puerto Rico a state, right? Because Puerto Rico is so left and Puerto Ricans are so left that they're gonna return left-wing legislators to the national government. That's out the window now. This realignment that's happening, which is happening on the basis of working class Americans coming together across their divides to essentially face the progressive left coalition and bring it to a tie. I want to close with this. That tie I would count as a victory, and here's why, independent of what the office is and how they're adjudicated. When you look at the powers that the left and the progressive side brought to bear in 2020, which by any estimation was a very difficult year in the history of our republic, between COVID and economic collapse, the left brought to bear a summer basically of insurrectionary activity in our cities. A lot of violence, a lot of rioting happened. If you look at the ACLED data, it's coming on to 2,000 incidents over the past 6 months. They brought to bear a social frenzy centered around critical race theory, with the idea that people, like many of us, are responsible for the sins of our ancestors. And then the final thing that they did was they brought to bear the power of big tech and big media, which openly colluded to promote the fortunes of their preferred candidate in the presidency. And so with all this power, cultural, social, economic, and frankly, the power of violence brought to bear upon the American electorate, nevertheless, the inherent strength of the emerging center-right coalition, this populist, working-class, multiracial coalition, was able to bring out a de facto tie last night. That's extraordinary. That was their maximum effort. We aren't at our maximum effort yet. We're only going to grow. They've plateaued. I feel very optimistic about the coming decade, Kevin.
You did a great job, Josh, of being more optimistic than Chuck. And so congratulations. Let's dig in a couple of ways about Texas specifically. The first is, it seems as if the long reported analysis forecast of the demise of Texas as a red state might be wrong this morning in ways that you outlined, I think, at a very high level. Chuck might be able to outline at a more granular level. Explain for us, Chuck, why this blue wave simply did not materialize in Texas. And even beyond that, people who spent hundreds of millions of dollars on that probably ought to be fired today.
Right. Well, they won't be. Just to continue with the pessimism, a lot of media malpractice out there with the pollsters. So if you look at the 2016 vote for president and the 2020 vote, we have 96% of the vote counted so far in Texas. And Trump's percentage of the vote in Texas stands at, I think it's 52.3%. 4 years ago, it was 53 or 52.2%, right? So he gained 1/10 of a point. And if you look at the raw total, it's up about, I think, a little less than 1.4 million. Am I remembering that correctly?
Correct, yeah, about 11 mil total.
Yeah, 1.4 million, pardon me, more votes for Trump than 4 years ago, right? So clearly, to what Josh was saying, this coalition is growing, and what you saw was more votes coming from, again, the improbable places that Josh outlined. Because think of it, what we've been told by the mainstream media and our betters, on the other side of the philosophical divide, is that high turnout elections always benefit the left. That's constantly what we've heard for decades now. Here we have then the highest turnout election in probably living Texas history. And you look at the state level, it appears that there are probably no changes in the state house. One state Senate seat that was going to be difficult to hold probably was gained by the Democrats. No changes at the congressional level, right? And you look at this, it's like, as Josh said, this was the maximum effort. And somehow nothing much changed. I think that this is really quite remarkable. And it does show the potential of an emerging new coalition when you can have such an enormous increase in turnout and really see essentially things just treading water in Texas itself. So I'm encouraged by this from the standpoint of I mean, think of this one thing, just this one thing in particular. The fact that in spite of the media narrative, there is a growing evidence that Black Americans voted more for the president than they did 4 years ago. And think of what it might mean to our body politic if you have a group of Americans who heretofore have not been considered in play, and now you have both major parties saying, hey, how can we improve your life? Let's talk. Let's have a dialogue about, your community and its challenges and how government might be standing in the way and making things worse, or how things might be better. That sort of honest conversation hasn't really taken place in this nation for probably 50 or 60 years, as far as a two-sided conversation.
No, that's really well put. And the policy implications are significant. You think about what we do here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, primarily in the legislature, just 2 blocks north of where we sit. The opportunity for us and for organizations and people and elected leaders who agree with us to go into the legislative session on behalf of Texas's nearly 30 million people and talk about a conservatism that isn't talking about limited government for the sake of small government. It's talking about that for the sake of working class families, for their flourishing, not just for the sake of their liberty, but for the sake of them to dream about an American dream, a Texas dream that government has only gotten in the way of. That is right here on our doorstep. And that is true even if former Vice President Biden ekes out a win at the presidential level, because the Republicans have held serve in the Texas House. In fact, it looks like there will be no change at all in the number of seats. Probably as we're broadcasting, I understand as we were going live, there's going to be an announcement that we will have a Republican Speaker of the Texas House. We, of course, have from a philosophical point of view, a very solid Texas Senate. We have conservatives statewide. The opportunity for this moment that the two of you are drawing is right in front of us. And so I would encourage people, whether folks here live in our theater today or folks who are tuning in online, who have been beset with this pessimism, to just push that out the window. That even if certain elections have not gone or will not go the way that we prefer, that the opportunity for great policy success is in front of us. So Josh, I want to frame that even more historically with you, because you mentioned something to me early this morning that I thought was really astute. And that was that, and this is just a historical point of view, it's not a partisan comment, that the Republican Party in 2020 on November 4th has gone back to its roots of the 50s, not the 1950s, but the 1850s.
Yeah, that's right. I think it probably has. You know, when you think of and this is a historical description, obviously not a partisan endorsement, but when you think of the origins of the Republicans in the 1850s, and this is a party identity that effectively continued really for the first quarter century of its existence, and then a coalition shift in American history, you're really talking about a smallholder free labor party that's very, very dedicated to the cause of national greatness, as they understood it. And so there was a sort of warlike small r republicanism that characterized the original Republicans, who were drawn from basically anti-slavery Whigs and like both the anti-slavery Democrats came together and formed this party back in the 1850s. And it's very, very interesting to see, because what we saw in sort of the original Lincolnian phase and actually I would argue the Grant administration as well, of the Republicans, is this incredibly robust, liberty-oriented party that was very, very good for working Americans, but that also was incredibly ferocious in the defense of rights, prerogatives, and essentially the place of the nation. And so it's a nation that in just a few short years, under this particular party's leadership, won a civil war, ended slavery, faced down the French Empire in Mexico, arguably faced down the British, found time to, people don't know this, attack Japan in 1863, concurrent with the Gettysburg Campaign. Who knew that, except for Kevin and Chuck. So like all this, and Tom, I guess, probably. The Shimonoseki expedition, look it up, kids. Now we're back to it, and it's fascinating, because what it really demonstrates is a couple of things. One is that the needs of citizens and the sentiments of citizens within a democratic republic don't actually change fundamentally. This is one argument that the folks on the other side, I think, get so grievously wrong. This idea that kind of the nature of man and the purpose of a republic and our role as citizens change across history, and that what's demanded of us in 2020 is fundamentally different than what was demanded in 1776 or 1836. That's not actually the case. That party is going back to the roots, and that coalition is going back to the roots. And man, when you think of what was originally accomplished, I'm excited for what the reformed coalition in the 2020s and beyond accomplishes.
Yeah, that's right. And I want to come back to that thought, projecting into the future about which other states in subsequent presidential election years might become part of that enlarging coalition, that expanding coalition. But before we do that, enough of this optimism, guys. Right now, as the election stands, we are facing, Chuck DeVore, an unmitigated mess. And so, as we like to say here at the foundation, we will tell you the truth, whether it's pretty or whether it's ugly. We've told you some pretty truths, and those are going to happen regardless of what happens with election results over the next few weeks. But for the next few weeks, my friend, you are projecting that we're in for a lot of uncertainty at best, and perhaps some social repercussions, more civil unrest as a result of not knowing who is going to be giving the next inaugural address. So what I would like for you to do for our audience is rather methodically, if you don't mind, walk us through what, in your best estimate, based on all of the reading you're doing and analysis and conversations you're having, the next week, the next 2 weeks look like.
Right. Thank you, Kevin. So first of all, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, in concert with the Claremont Institute, ran over the course of a week, beginning 4 weeks ago, a post-election simulation. The report is posted on our website. It's called the 79 Days Report, referring to the 79 days from last night to Inauguration Day on January 20th, 2021. It basically laid out both a scenario, most of which were actually seen unfolding before our very eyes exactly the way we wrote it down. And it not only laid out the scenario, it tested the different pathways by which our Constitution, which was really built for difficult times, allows us to kind of work through this process that we're seeing right now. And so what we saw was that because of a combination between these states that moved to mail-in ballots, many of which could not begin counting those ballots until last night, along with how close we thought it was going to be in Pennsylvania and Michigan, you saw no leader, no winner declared on election night. Well, that's happened. What we quickly saw then, of course, was competing lawsuits. We saw an escalation of urban violence, very targeted violence, not violence just for the sake of violence, but violence that had a specific purpose in mind, which was to pressure local elections officials and judges and politicians into backing off and allowing a certain individual to be declared the winner in that state. And when you think about what's going on right now, and you see, for example, this morning reports out of Michigan that some 138,000 votes were added to the total of Vice President Biden without one vote being added for anyone else. And you look at that and it is possible that that's an error, that could have been a tabulation issue. It's also possible that could just be outright voting fraud, election fraud. The problem is, of course, in many of these areas that are tabulating, for example, in Detroit, it's probably the case that in places like Detroit or perhaps Atlanta, Fulton County, Georgia, or Philadelphia, that individuals who want to go and observe the counting are being barred from doing so. That's not uncommon when you have corrupt urban political machines running the show. So the challenge is then at this point is we don't know how many of those mail-in ballots that came in are in fact valid. Do they have signatures that match real live voters? Were they cast in time? Did they show up in time? Do they have a postmark on them? Are they legitimate votes? We don't know. Perhaps they are. Perhaps they're not, right? And in the case of these corrupt urban centers that have long, proud traditions of corruption, how do you go in and undo that? Well, the Constitution has an answer, although it's certainly not necessarily clean, and it may require a bit of moral courage. The Constitution says that the method for the selection of the electors belongs to the state legislatures. And in the case of Michigan and Pennsylvania, unless the results are vastly different than what I'm seeing, in both states you have majorities of in the upper and lower house among the Republicans. So what you may very well see is in these states where you have Democrat secretaries of state and governors and Republican-controlled legislative chambers, you may see competing slates of electors impaneled to send their votes to Washington, D.C. Now, things get even crazier. So to win, everyone thinks you need 270 votes to win. You don't. You need a 50% plus one of the legally impaneled electors. So if all 538 are impaneled and vote, then you need 270. If you get anything less than that, it goes to the House of Representatives. And again, we gamed all this out. This is what we kind of saw was coming at us, and we went into very detailed on a over a 7-day period with these 35 experts that we brought together. And so the next challenge is, if it goes to the House, you need 26 states voting by state delegation to win for the president. The vice president, if they don't have 270, is selected in the US Senate. Okay, you need 26 states. Going into the election, the Republicans had 26 states. Democrats had 22, and 2 state delegations were tied. There's nothing I'm seeing right now with the results that suggest that that has shifted or gotten worse for the Republicans. Because right now, as of this morning, it's looking like the Republicans are picking up 7 seats in the House. And I don't think they're losing, they may, but I don't think they're losing any of those state delegations. But wait, there's another twist. Each House in America, both at the federal level and generally at the state level, to my knowledge, in all 50 states, each House is a judge of who's actually won the election. So you thought it was your Secretary of State or your local elections officials. No. It may be Nancy Pelosi. This happens about every 10 years in the House of Representatives, where if you have a close race that was contended over, with charges of fraud or voter suppression, you just have the majority decide, well, no, you're not a member of the House of Representatives. We don't like the way your election results came out. We're going to impanel the other person, your competitor. And so potentially the speaker could do that if there wasn't some huge uproar in the country stopping her. She could do that and prevent 25 states or 26 states from having a majority of Republicans to presumably reelect the president. In which case, it gets worse. According to the Succession Act, the Speaker of the House would become temporarily President of the United States.
It definitely just got worse.
Oh my goodness. And you asked me to be the pessimist, right? So I think I'm fulfilling that role. And so if that were to happen though, and let's say Vice President Pence became vice president through the US Senate, the Pelosi presidency would be a short period, because what you would see is that the vice president would probably be elevated. And so presumably he could then select Trump as his vice president, then he could resign.
All right, I'm going to stop you right here.
It's all constitutional. I tell you, we've thought this out. So anyway, not to say that will happen.
Thanks for coming to our event, everybody.
Yeah, Josh, good luck following that response.
Okay, can we talk about Space Force?
Sure.
Right.
Let's colonize Mars, right?
Okay, yeah. Please.
Yeah. So in the middle of all of this, we've got, actually, all kidding aside, excellent, thorough analysis by Chuck, who's been leading this gaming scenario for the last few weeks. Take us to a higher level, Josh, and please. And what should people who are tuning in, people who are sitting here in the theater do, whether they're left of center, right of center, regardless of which candidate they voted for? What are the kinds of things we need to be doing and saying during this period of uncertainty?
If you are left of center, become right of center. In seriousness, the elections are supposed to release tension in democratic society. It's like a spring, like a spring uncoiling. And this election has done the opposite. It's actually ratcheted up the tension. Mm-hmm. And so the first obligation of every citizen is to behave as a citizen. And the core of that, especially as conservatives, is to understand that our responsibilities precede our rights, and that we have rights so we can best fulfill our responsibilities. And among those responsibilities is the maintenance of civility toward your neighbor, decency toward your community, and sustenance for your fellow man, putting your family and neighborhood first. It's something that's often forgotten. And for those who are inculcated with a political fanaticism, mostly we've seen on the left, although there are some on the right like this as well, who think that the answer is taking to the streets, smashing storefronts, setting fire to communities. Those individuals are in the wrong, and they should desist. And public officials charged with the maintenance of law and order need to understand that they have a responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. So job one in these trying times is to maintain the civic friendship. You know, that's the classical definition of patriotism that we have an obligation to express as Americans. Job two is to fight like hell within the parameters of law and decency, to make sure that the election is adjudicated in a proper way. There's going to be a bifurcation that you're going to see coming out over the coming days and weeks. There's going to be one side that's going to appeal to an ill-defined intent of the voter and counting the votes. There's going to be another side that appeals to actual law and actual process. And it's no question which side we're on. We're on the side of law and process, because that is the only way in which an ordered society persists and maintains. So choose your side and choose the right side on that. Those who are arguing for voter intent over law and process are largely the same individuals who find penumbras and emanations in the Constitution. And we know where that leads. So let's make sure that we stay on a process of rectitude. And if we do that, then whatever the outcome, back to Kevin's original point, whether it's the guy we voted for or not, we can accept it and move on as Americans and fellow citizens.
That's right. Very well said. So I'm going to ask each of you one more question, and then we'll turn to audience questions. So if you're sitting in the audience and you have a question, be thinking about it, formulating it as something really concise. If you're online, surely we have some system of you sending a question, which would be entering in the comments box, and I think it's going to show up on my phone. All of that said, Chuck DeVore, the scenario I want to present you with is a Biden win. We'll have a much narrower Democratic majority in the US House. In fact, just as we were coming on stage, it looked like the Republicans will pick up at least 10 seats. It's going to be very narrow for the Democrats, and a narrow Republican majority in the Senate. What policies do you think will receive priorities at the federal level in a Biden administration with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate? What should we be looking for if that's the scenario that we end up being in?
Well, as I see it, you have a president in this case who is soon to be 78 years old, who isn't particularly as energetic, or will be an energetic executive as kind of foretold or desired by our founders. And so I would imagine that the administration is going to be populated with a lot of very angry left-wing people who will go to what was started under President Obama and then largely reversed under President Trump, in using the administrative state, the famous telephone and a pen, to enact a series of regulations to, for example, put in place a carbon tax, a ban on fracking on federal lands, re-enter the Paris Accord, and to, in short order, do a lot of really bad defense and foreign policy decisions, because of course the president has primacy in that area. So you're likely to see a re-entry into the Iranian agreement. You're going to see more accommodations probably to the People's Republic of China. You're going to see this effort to reindustrialize America kind of stall out. And at the same time, you'll see efforts to really strengthen the government union movement in the country, because that's a source of revenue and of political power. So it seems to me, and with a divided legislature, it's very difficult then to put a check on that, right? So that administrative state has been pruned, but the roots of it have not been attacked yet. And so I think the only really good thing is that because the Senate is likely to remain in Republican control, any attempt to pack the courts is dead on arrival. And there's been an enormous amount of constitutionally minded jurists that have been put in place in the last 4 years. So there may be some opportunities there from a lawsuit standpoint to start to attack the administrative state, which really sprang into existence about 120 years ago and has really not slowed down since.
Sure, and I'll just underscore one point there, which is, and from the perspective of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, for a few months at the very senior levels of our foundation, we have been game planning each scenario. And in this scenario in which there is a Biden administration, we would anticipate that for us, For example, at the federal level, we will be doing a lot of litigation. That a lot of that will be not just defense from some of the really poor ideas of a Biden administration, but also on offense, because the Trump administration has been very successful in placing a few hundred federal judges. So for those of you who are curious about what TPPF will be doing in a Biden administration, if those are the results, number one, we accept them as legitimate. If in fact every valid vote has been counted and every invalid vote has not been counted. And secondly, we, to Josh's point, will fight like hell for what is right and just. So Josh, you get the other scenario. President Trump wins re-election, same situation in Congress. You have slim Democrat majority in the House, slim Republican majority in the Senate. What would you anticipate the policy priorities to be?
I think it's largely going to be more of the same, which is, from a policy perspective, largely positive. It's going to be continuing the push for deregulation, continuing the push to reform the judiciary in positive ways. It's going to be continuing. One thing that I think you might see, and I don't have any information on this, but it's just a hunch, see the administration re-engage on is a renewed attempt to reform healthcare in America. So in a sense, that configuration, which has already existed, is a preview. With the exception that I don't think the House is going to try impeachment again, because that didn't work, and you didn't even hear about it during the campaign. So that's probably what we have to look forward to. But look, in my opinion, again, from a strictly policy perspective, that's a positive. It has been decades since the states had this much latitude to innovate, and so I look forward to more of that. And in fact, I would almost dare say that the states is where the action is really going to be by the end of the second term.
Absolutely. That's one thing we know will be the case, or we think will be the case in both scenarios, right? That those of us who believe in federalism should be really, really happy, because in a Biden win, obviously we'll be leaning on federalism, considering, as we saw last night, the strength in Texas electorally of conservatively minded officials. I think that bodes well, not just for us in Texas, but for the rest of the country. In the Trump scenario, we also have to check against this sometimes capital R Republican tendency to issue a bunch of executive orders that might feel good in the moment, but it's terrible in the long term. And so I think we will be talking about states taking as much action as they can as well. So gentlemen, great job here. Obviously, there are some smarter questions coming from our audience. And so we'll first turn to our in-person audience here. Clinton Neesmith has the microphone. If you just wait for the mic to come to you so that our friends online can hear. Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, Texas 20 years ago the Republicans started in the rural Texas. It really was the suburban areas that built on the majorities that they gained. Here in the last two cycles, those suburban counties, Fort Bend County has now gone Clinton Biden. Williamson County, you had the Carrollton legislative race that stayed Democrat. Have the suburban areas gone left, and what is the message for the working class, middle class suburban families in terms of conservative ideas that resonate with them?
Excellent question. I would like both of you to answer that, but we'll start with you, Josh.
I think it's difficult to know the exact cause yet. One thing that is very plausibly driving the conservative retreat in suburban areas is, and this is not a secret, is that Anglo suburban women do not like the president on policy and aesthetic grounds. I'm married to one of them actually, and so it's been a fun fall. So the extent to which the suburban tinge blue is driven by that is an open question, and also concurrent with that, when the president finally exits the national scene, which inevitably he will at some point, does that flip back to kind of a more normal pattern where basically soccer moms and moms who drive their kids to school tend to be more red than blue? We don't know the answer to that yet. It could be momentary, it could be circumstantial. Beyond that, though, we've known for years, for decades actually, that urbanization correlates to leftward drift in voting. And so when you look at it in Texas specifically, the core of Democratic Party strength has traditionally been among the 5 big urban areas in the state. It hasn't been true for some of the mid-sized cities, the Shermans, the Corpus Christi's, the Amarillos, the Lubbocks, which have more or less reliably returned red conservative votes. If that's changing, if the urbanization is radiating outward, that's something that we're going to know in this decade. But I would suggest that it speaks to the need, which is present regardless, and I wouldn't say let's not wait to find out, but as conservatives and as people who value liberty, we do need to, this illuminates the need that we need to speak directly to and find answers for individuals and fellow citizens who live in suburban and urban communities. And look, we can do it. If we've done it with African Americans, Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, and so on, there's no reason we can't do it for city dwellers as well.
Chuck?
Yeah, that's kind of the main question, isn't it? If you look at each election, certainly is a unique snapshot in time. It's driven by both what's happening economically, what's happening in the nation and around the world, and it's also driven by the personalities that are at the top of the ballot. So we've had now 2 cycles in the last 4 years. Well, actually just going back to 2018 as well, when Senator Ted Cruz was on the top of the ballot and won by just barely over 2%. And now President Trump, who, while his victory was about 6 points versus 9 points 4 years ago, appears to have gotten slightly more as a percentage. And so it seems to me, kind of run the counterfactual for a moment. What would have happened if the People's Republic of China had not successfully conducted gain of function research on COVID-19 and through sloppy, laboratory management, let it get out and then lied to the world and let it spread? Okay, one would imagine that today we would have continued to have the lowest unemployment rates for a vast swath of Americans by race and ethnicity, gender, than we've seen in 50 years. And we probably would be looking at very different results right now. And the perceived idiosyncrasies of the president, insofar as his affinity for using Twitter or acting like a New Yorker from time to time. I married a New Yorker, so she's perfectly happy with the guy because he speaks her language. But it doesn't work everywhere, right? Mm. So one could imagine, though, in that counterfactual, things would have been very different, but that's not how things worked out.
That's
right? That's just the way it was. So I'm not certain yet that there's like any sort of a long-term trend that we can draw. I do think, though, that there is one thing that we've ignored at our peril, which is the teaching of proper civics education to both our children in K-12 and in college. We have somehow managed to raise a cohort of young people, unless they were homeschooled, who have this understanding of the American founding as fundamentally flawed and sinful from the start. And that somehow in this alternative universe, America is the worst country. I just look at this and I go, really? Have you traveled? Okay? Because I've seen a few other places, whether as a civilian or in the military. And if you're grading on the curve, we're kind of near the top, maybe at the top, I don't know. And somehow we're not getting that out to the children, right?
That's right.
And I think that is also hurting us because we've taken that for granted at our peril.
And on that point, civics education, I would say, is the top priority for this foundation at the state level and federal level, regardless of who wins the presidency. I will add something to these good responses about your suburban voter question, and that is, we do have some states where I think we ought to be, those of us who are conservatives, ought to be somewhat concerned about the future of suburban votes. But then conversely, there are some states, Florida, Wisconsin, I can think of right off the bat, where suburban votes were very solid last night. And I think that what conservatives should do, if they're interested in that, is go in and see what the messaging was in those suburban areas and transfer that to other states. What I love about that, even for someone who's a liberal, they're going to do the same thing, is that it reminds us that elections are about local places and about local people and about state issues. And I think that's the kind of thing, regardless of who ends up winning the presidential election, that we here at TPPF will be talking about for the next 4 years. Thanks for the question. Next question. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for the panel. I'm curious about what the what you think a little bit more about the election results in South Texas in particular. And although it didn't necessarily go red, but it certainly in some places seemed to go less blue. And there seems to be doors opening in that region of the state, which has long been abandoned by conservatives. Do you think that there might be an opportunity for conservative policies to actually, for conservative legislators to go into those areas and try to promote more conservative policies in order to get them more solidly conservative?
Excellent question. Josh, you want to field that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the answer is yes. And of course, you and I have worked directly on this, Ruff, over many years. You know, what you're seeing here is a byproduct. I wish I could say is just partly, you know, if I had to guess, 30% conservative foresight and 70% left-wing neglect. The progressive coalition has changed over the years. You know, it used to be, you know, think back to, well, I'll think back to when I was growing up. So I was born in '75, and the left wing that I remember, you know, from the 1980s was predominantly concerned with economic issues. They were a big government left wing, and so kind of the last vestiges of the New Deal coalition. And it's you know, it's Gary Hart's, and it's Walter Mondale's, and it's George McGovern's, and it's you know, and then you get into kind of the Bill Clintons. And that was that was a coalition that had a lot of appeal, specifically, you know, for communities like I'm from in Mexican American areas in South Texas. And so what has happened with the progressive coalition, particularly over the last decade, and I would encourage you, you know, those of you, I'm now going to ask you to go look at polls, but these are different polls. These are not 2020 polls. But look at Gallup polling, particularly through Barack Obama's second term. And there's a really interesting turn that happens in the 2012-2013 timeframe when the progressive coalition effectively shifts from being a coalition that's interested predominantly in economics and class redistribution into something that's very much more focused on race and identity. And it was a subtle shift at first. Now it's a very explicit one. But that shift, to your question, I think is what opens up the opportunity for conservatives, because a hypothetical family in Hidalgo County, Texas, that is very interested in, you know, name your big government program, lots of Social Security, expanded Medicaid, you know, an active government role in the economy, and will vote for the left as long as that is what the left espouses, is suddenly off the bus when that same left-wing coalition suddenly gets really interested in identity and kind of virtue signaling, and starts talking about being liable for the sins of your ancestors. And you have too many kids for the earth to support, and your F-250 is wrong. Like that's a no-go. You shouldn't own guns, and by the way, we hate God, right? Like all this sort of things. And these are implicitly communicated, although sometimes explicitly. But that progressive shift to identity politics in this way, and with the introduction of critical race theory into the discourse, blows it open with these minority groups that hitherto were perfectly fine with a big government left, but now don't have a political home. And we on the right actually have an opportunity to go in and talk to them, you know, in some cases for the first time, and make some inroads.
We'll switch to a question from an online audience member. And this person asks, I'll pitch this to you, Chuck. Is there a realistic expectation that we might get to the bottom of election integrity issues before inauguration? What are the key states or areas where ballot integrity is most questionable?
So the challenge with any of the effort to go into places like Philadelphia or Detroit and really do a forensic analysis is that will be resisted with every means at their disposal, both legally through kind of mob intimidation at the gubernatorial and Secretary of State level. And what will happen is our major media will reinforce then the narrative that the president and his allies are conducting voter suppression, and that they're trying to throw out these legally cast ballots. And that's the only thing that you're going to hear. The only way that you're going to hear any counter response to that is when the president tweets, and then of course Jack at Twitter is going to erase the tweet or block it. Which, by the way, we gamed out in our simulation that happened multiple times. in
It's
the
a
simulation.
shame that was so predictable.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the first time that happened with Twitter blocking the New York Post literally happened within a few days after we completed our exercise. So that was that was interesting. So so it's going to be very difficult to get to the bottom of it, which is why I mentioned the legislators in those states potentially voting to impanel an alternative slate of electors, because they know their own states. They know what's going on there. The question is, do they have the moral courage to act? And so maybe they will, maybe they won't, right? And we, this isn't like a new problem. We've had corrupt elections in America going back to our founding. It's a nature, it's a feature and a defect of a democratic process. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why we're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. We just happen to use elections to elect representatives, and in this case, elect a process that sends electors to vote in an electoral college. So I think it's going to be difficult to get to the bottom of, because what you're seeing, of course, is this push that because of COVID-19 and because of supposed efforts by the Republicans to engage in voter suppression, we have to throw out all the rules and we have to allow dead people to vote more than once by mail, right? I mean, are you discriminatory against dead people?
Absolutely. When it comes to voting.
Yeah. I thought that you said that given that you were originally from Louisiana, that you had a certain affinity toward that, though.
Well, my dead ancestors in Louisiana are now voting for the conservative candidate.
Okay. All right. There you go.
We'll take a couple more questions. The next one from the audience right here live and in person. Yes, sir.
Assuming that there is a Trump win for the presidency and, I guess call it however you want for the House and the Senate, how likely do you think we will see reforms in terms of school choice and education? He's paid a lot of, he's been campaigning on it for a while, but obviously the past 4 years, there weren't really much at the federal level that was actually passed. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'll take that one because I'm so involved in our foundation's school choice efforts. If Trump wins the election and just looking at the news as we're sitting here, it looks like that's still very much a possibility. I think school choice is going to be at the top of the list. Well, it'll be number 2 on the list. Number 1 on the list will be devastating the deep state, praise God. But the second, and it's related, is going to be school choice. And the reason is that COVID, but particularly the shutdowns, has laid bare what everyone in this room and everyone online knows, whether you're liberal or conservative or a centrist. And that is, we have an antiquated system of educating most American students. I don't even have to get into the intentions of that, although I think some of the intentions are very questionable, to say that it's outdated, that the money that comes from our pockets and is sent to many government entities to flow back to classrooms actually doesn't really get to classrooms. It gets to systems and unions rather than children and teachers. And just as President Trump has made very clear a lot of truly systemic problems in America, I think he understands that this is number 1 on the list. I understand that one of his main advisors, who happens to be his daughter, Ivanka, sees this as her top issue. And what excites us here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is that she and everyone in the Trump administration see school choices, including better workforce development programs. And that goes hand in hand with what Josh is talking about as a working class movement. And it's very, very exciting for those of us who are movement conservatives. Right now, it seems that the Republican Party is the party aligned with that. If there were another party that were, then that would be great too. This is not a partisan comment, but I would be very high on that. You then ask the devil's advocate question. Well, what about the US House? That majority is now so thin, it's something that's lost in the shuffle of all of these election results. Nancy Pelosi will be lucky to be reelected Speaker. It'll be another Democrat, but the US House is absolutely in play when it comes to policies over the next 4 years. And I think that's another sign of optimism or example of optimism that we should have. So thank you for that question. I'm going to pick one of these additional questions from online, gentlemen, pitch that to the two of you, and then we will wrap up. Because I know y'all have had short sleep and you're remarkably energetic and still optimistic, which I like.
I'm tapping into the President Trump's vibe.
Yeah, that's amazing. See, which of these stirs the pot the most? Oh, here we go. We had a Trump scenario question. What might we expect, Josh Trevino, from a Harris administration if Biden becomes unwell?
Have I mentioned literally Hitler? No. I don't mean that. Please don't burn my house down. Look, my friend Dan McLaughlin at National Review, who actually is a two-time non-Trump voter, but he has mentioned several times that the one thing that could push him off the fence would be if Kamala Harris was a presidential nominee. And look, I think, and I argued with him unsuccessfully that her as a vice presidential nominee was making her a presidential nominee de facto. This is an individual, again, this is not a partisan estimation. This is just from a policy standpoint. This is an individual who is proven throughout her career to do whatever it takes to acquire and amass power. It seems to be her one core principle. It's very difficult to detect. Really, she's not an ideologue as such, although she is of the left, but she does love power. She's an individual who has joked about keeping individuals in jail on false pretenses. She's an individual who actively used her office in California to persecute pro-life activists. She is an individual who actively intervened on behalf of the political enemies against the political enemies of progressive groups, including Planned Parenthood. And so with the power of the federal government behind her, I'm candidly frightened as to what she might do. I don't see a lot of practical limits on her willingness to use the Department of Justice, the FBI, the National Security Agency, anything else on behalf of her political fortunes. And it pains me to say that. I think she is somebody who's qualitatively unique. Kamala Harris is what the left accuses Donald Trump of being. And again, to steal from my friend Dan, because this is his observation, but I think it's entirely correct. When you look at the criticisms of Donald Trump and the purported threats, again, depending on which issue of the Atlantic you've picked up, the threats that he poses to American democracy, even if you take those at face value and you accept them all, the reality is that the threats that Donald Trump presents are threats to which the American Republic and the federal government has really strong antibodies. He's somebody who talks like a guy from Queens, Donnie from Queens on AM radio, you're on the air. But ultimately it's talk. He really is one of the least authoritarian presidents to occupy the office in generations, which is incredible to say. It's true. You have to go back to I think, honestly, can't believe I'm saying this, you have to go back to Jimmy Carter to find somebody who's as reluctant to use the powers of the office, which is good for those of us who love liberty. Kamala Harris is the exact opposite. And again, to the McLaughlin observation, the threats that Kamala Harris poses to American democracy and the function of government are threats to which the antibodies in the system are very, very weak. Because imagine an authoritarian president who has the enthusiastic cooperation of the entire bureaucracy and an elite class in DC that wants her to use the power, will support it, coupled with a media class that will cover for it all the way. This is a danger to the Republic, and it is something that fills me with dread.
Thanks for being clear. So I'll ask the last question. I'll ask the last question of the two of you gentlemen, and that is, you woke up this morning after just a few hours of sleep, I'm sure. Why are you optimistic about the future of America?
I'm optimistic about the future of America because, this is America. You look at our founding principles. What other nation was founded with the premise that we're all equal in God's sight, right? And that the purpose of government isn't to give us liberty. We already have that intrinsically because we're created in God's image. And so the premise of America is wholly unique amongst the founding of nations throughout history. And it's really hard for me to believe that despite the times we're living in, despite our challenges, despite the flawed personalities that are leading us, that, by the way, has always been the case because there's only been one person that has ever walked the earth that was perfect, and they're not in our government right now.
It's Kevin, right?
Oh my. So when you look at that and you look at where we are now, I think that what we have, and that we shouldn't sell ourselves short, is that we have this amazing ability for regenerative renewal, that we come up to this really difficult spot. I mean, you look at the post-Civil War period, and you look at Reconstruction, and then eventually the nation kind of got exhausted. And then in a corrupt political deal in 1876, we withdrew. Reconstruction, Jim Crow kind of blossomed. And then it was another 70 years before we again re-engaged on that issue, again imperfectly, but moving in the right direction. You look at that history that we have, we constantly kind of rise up and start anew based on our founding premise. And I just have to believe that as long as that constitutional structure remains in place, and as long as we haven't blown it up as the progressive experiment wants to, that we still have that capacity, that amazing capacity for self-governance with rule of law, ordered liberty. So I remain, perhaps at my core, the hopeless optimist.
Thank you. Josh?
For over half a century, only American teams have won the Super Bowl. That is testament to our greatness. We can have an all-American football contest and limit it to American teams, and it's still the world championship. But the other part of it, the late Peter Schramm from the Ashbrook Center had a really, really great, and I encourage you to look this up. It's an essay online, but I'll get to the best part about it, talking about when he and his family fled communist Hungary after the 1956 revolution there. And if I remember correctly, Schramm was maybe 11 years old, something like that. And so they're packing up. They're going to flee to Austria and then get to the United States. And so Schramm asks his dad, where are we going? Because everything that he knows and loves is about to be taken away as a child. And his dad says, we're going to America. And Schramm says, why America? To him, it meant nothing. And his dad said, because son, we were born American, but in the wrong place. And that hope that is reposed in America speaks to exactly what Chuck said, which is that America is founded in a proposition about the nature of man. And if you believe in that proposition, and if you believe in its promise, and if you believe that it really is truly the last best hope of man on earth, then you have no choice but to be optimistic, because to withdraw from it is to betray who you are. And that's why.
Yeah, well said. Well, Josh Trevino, Chuck DeVore, you did what I knew you would do, which is an excellent job on a tough day of analyzing these things. And I'm really grateful that you gave us some hope and some proper perspective, regardless of what happens with the election this year. And in fact, I think that's a good segue into my closing comment, which is that what distinguishes us as Americans is that we've always been grateful for what we've inherited. And what we've inherited is an ideal, which is much greater than even a country. And whenever we know the legitimate outcome of this presidential election, let us in this room, us here in this online community, pledge to really cultivate this culture of inheritance, as prior Americans would remind us. It is every single day, not just a privilege, but a blessing to wake up in this country. Please join me in giving these two friends a great round of applause. Have a great day, a great week, and we will see you soon.